welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I have a very special guest, Professor Helen Lovatt, who is my personal tutor here at Nottingham.
Brilliant, thanks for having me, Han.
Oh, that's totally okay. So today we're talking about Helen's new book, In Search of the Argonauts, which just recently came out, but it's now doing the rounds on Classics Instagram and Twitter, and I thought it would be really interesting for you guys to hear what she had to say.
So I'm Helen Lovatt and I'm a Professor of Classics at the University of Nottingham. I work on lots of different aspects of the ancient world, mainly Latin epic, but also Greek mythology and its reception. So that's really what I've been doing in the Argonauts book, which was something I actually developed from a module that I teach at Nottingham. So I started teaching this in 2006 and now, finally in 2021, I have actually finished the book. Yay!
So when did the book actually start? When did you start putting like pen to paper, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this has been my major research project since 2013. So
wow.
I've been writing it for a while and reading lots of Argonaut stuff, but the main bulk of the work was done when I was on research leave a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So I've basically been gathering the stuff.
Slowly. And
lots and lots of stuff.
Let's start off with why you even did this in the first place.
Yeah, so for the module, I was basically I wanted to give the students a sense of how myth works, because they quite often would come to me with ideas for research projects or something, and they seemed frequently to have a conception that there is sort of one version of a myth.
Yeah.
Which I call the myth. And I know that like professional mythographers don't have that idea, and that everyone knows there are lots of variants, but there are quite a lot of people who, even though they will say that, still have this sort of idea of the ideal authentic version of the myth,
Yeah.
which I think probably comes from whichever version it was that they encountered first.
Yeah.
I've also, from this project, I've developed an interest in children's literature, and I've published an edited volume on that with a friend. And I feel like children's literature is really underestimated as a sort of shaping force for how people understand myth. So that was sort of where I started from, and I picked the Argonaut myth because it is incredibly varied from an early stage, but also because I wanted to give my students a chance to read like both a Greek epic and a Latin epic, which is a really sort of fun way of engaging with the two different main cultures of the ancient world. I mean, there's also, you know, lots of possible sort of Near Eastern roots and so on. It's a really interesting, varied topic. And then when I got into the reception, and I was like, oh wow, there is stuff because there's so much written about Medea, but not so much written about Jason.
Yeah.
And you know, sort of critiquing masculinity is just as important as sort of prioritizing the representation of women.
Well,
So
I think there was so many interesting things that you touched on there that I definitely want to get back to. Firstly, I thought it was really interesting how you talked about the versions of the myth and what's the right version for you, and like what do you think is the original version of a myth, because that's something that you write about near the end of your book, that Hope touched on, and I'll put her Instagram here. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting about how influential the first version that you would read would be on your like perceptions of everything and about that myth, because it's so easy to sort of, if I find like a lot of students will come in who've read like Percy Jackson or who've watched something, and then they get all confused when it's different or it's wrong, but it's not necessarily wrong, it's just a different way of interpreting it.
I think when you've grown up in the sort of 20th century culture of publication, where there is sort of like one authorised version that is centrally produced and that is the same for everyone and everyone reads it, it's quite hard to cope with the variety and complexity of ancient storytelling.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One thing that I thought that was interesting that you touched on near the beginning of your book was about how the Argonauts myth could be seen as sort of like the inspiration for a lot of the sections of the Odyssey, which I thought was crazy because I've never really read about the Argonauts before, but obviously everyone does the Odyssey at like school, or they start off with it at university because it's a really easy text to ease into. And I was just thinking, like, of course they're linked because the sort of sections are so similar. But do you think that can you tell me a bit more about that and about the sort of origin stories of these sort of early traditional myths that have just made its way into different civilizations at different times?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, I mean, obviously, when Homer has this sort of cultural prestige that everybody starts with Homer. So, literature starts with Homer, all of that. But those oral traditions that produced the Iliad and the Odyssey, whether or not they were written down by a single person at some point, had been around for a really long time, and they coexisted alongside a lot of other oral traditions as well, probably crossing from different cultures, from Near Eastern cultures and so on. So the Argonaut tradition and the Odyssey tradition probably had been alongside each other for hundreds, possibly even thousands of years. So there's a lot of opportunities for them to sort of shape each other and exchange with each other. And we don't really know that much about the origins of ancient stories. It's really hard to actually say anything meaningful about them. And it's something that fascinates people, that people really want to know.
But you can't.
But actually, beyond what references in the Homeric poems and visual culture and material culture that has to be interpreted and put into frameworks in order to say, okay, this is a statue of Jason or whatever. You have to have evidence to make sense of that. It's actually really hard to say what happened in the early development of the myth. But it's if you look at what we know about the early Argonaut myth, and then we put that next to what we have in the Odyssey, it could have gone either way. But it's a credible argument that the Argonaut story may have come first. It's certainly represented in the ancient sources as an earlier story.
Yeah. So that's so interesting. So do you have any sort of theories as to why the Odyssey has this prestige but the Argonauts doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with the ancient reception and the accidents of survival. So the Homeric poems had this enormous prestige in the ancient world, and whereas the first sustained extant narrative of the Argonauts is from the Hellenistic period, which is a lot later. So Apollonius was writing already after a very long tradition of people who had written about and created other cultural artifacts about the Argonaut story. And it's a very rich source, but it's also it's typical of the Hellenistic period in a lot of ways, in its very learned, complex, difficult, playful, sort of tonally uneven. So, as a poem, I absolutely love it. I mean, I love the Iliad and Odyssey as well, but in lots of ways, I love the Argonautica even more because it's just so cool and weird. And that does make it harder to engage with. I think students enjoy the Odyssey a lot more straightforwardly, and they find the Argonautica quite hard.
Yeah, I can't imagine tackling that, as a teenager, because when I was at school, the Odyssey was given to us when we were maybe like 13, 14, and I mean, obviously every year that you go back to it, I mean, I've got a copy for different years, and the notes are so much more detailed because I understand it at a different level, but I can't imagine doing something so complicated, or more complicated on the face of it and harder to engage with at a young age. So maybe that's like a reason why it isn't in schools at that stage.
Yeah, and a lot of what we teach in schools is still determined by what was done in the 19th century. Yeah. So Apollonius was not as popular in the 19th century.
I mean, I was really shocked that I did Antigone for my GCSE, because that's quite dark for a child. I mean, fair enough, you're not that young, but I was a bit traumatised by it when just in the cave.
Yeah, no, it's dark. A lot of classical literature is dark, but I think that's what makes it, worth doing. It's very challenging, and it gets people thinking. And children are not averse to difficult and complex things.
Yeah.
But you know, I think the problem more is in adult perceptions of what's appropriate for children.
Yeah, definitely. I even sometimes feel a bit protective of, you know, even the freshers that ask me questions about, which is silly because, you know, they are adults, but I sort of think, oh, well, I wouldn't want to have heard that, or, you know, and it's, you know, when you study the ancient world, you can't just filter out all the things that you don't want to see, because you're missing like really crucial information, and you kind of have to face it all and take it all on in order to get like the accurate, you know, interpretation. But I think that's really interesting how, because I think I've read on your university staff profile that you look into sort of how difficult topics are like talked about in children's versions of myths. Yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. That's something that you're going into.
Yeah, I am quite interested in that, and I fundamentally believe that children are quite capable of deciding for themselves what they want to engage with, and that they have a lot of agency. And I had a lot of fun when we did our children's edited book. I actually interviewed my children.
Oh, really?
About my son was like, I was like, what would this book be like if you were writing it? And he was like, very short.
That's such a typical response.
But but they found, I mean, my daughter's a big fan of the Percy Jackson books as well. And what you said about how people are sort of shocked when it's different from what they expect. As far as she was concerned, Percy Jackson is canon and Homer is wrong.
Oh yeah, obviously. And also
Rick Riordan is a woman. She says, she always refers to Rick with she pronouns, and she just thinks of Rick as a woman's name.
See, I love it how everybody sort of has these sort of like funny personal like comments about people from the ancient world or characters from the ancient world that they sort of have like a weird attachment to.
Yeah.
But it's different for all individuals. I have a bit of a thing about Augustus, and it's not like I'm a particular Augustus fan, but I will like die on the hill that he was super attractive, even though I know for a fact he wasn't.
Yeah.
And that's something that Erica and I talked about in our video. I can't even remember where we were.
I think we're talking about how everyone fancies Medea.
Yeah, everyone. So we'll see if this works for this final time. Yeah, so everybody always backs Medea and hates on Jason. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that's Euripides' fault, like fundamentally. I mean, obviously Medea is a really cool character and really interesting, and so not denying that. You know, everyone has every right to fancy Medea, but Jason, I think, varies a lot in the tradition. So it's quite interesting to see how, like before Euripides in Pindar, he's very heroic, and it's him who takes charge of the relationship and sort of seduces Medea actively rather than the gods taking control of the situation. And you know, like his Medea is sort of like a divine figure. She's a little bit sort of far away.
Yeah.
You know, she's a prophet. She's not really a relatable character, I think, in Pindar in the same way that she is in other versions. And then in Euripides, it's all focusing on very intensely on Medea and her emotions, and Jason is painted in about as negative a light as he possibly can be, both in ancient Greek terms and in modern terms. So I think Euripides is really sort of being tendentious and trying to shake up the tradition.
Yeah.
And then, you know, Apollonius is sort of balancing the two, the sort of the positive Jason that you can see in Pindar, which could itself be tendentious. So we don't know that the original, as it were, we don't know that the Jason of the oral tradition was a straightforward character either, because after all, Odysseus is not a straightforward character.
Yeah.
But, you know, Pindar's Jason is pretty positive, Euripides is pretty negative, Apollonius is sort of playing the two off against each other, so you end up with this very ambivalent character, and that means that later sort of creators are, you know, they have a whole range already of ancient versions of Jason to play with, and then they can each do something completely different. So basically, you know, he looks different, he acts differently, there are just so many different Jasons, and I think that's one of the things that fascinates me about the myth, and it's so many different types of masculinity, both successful and unsuccessful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's something that maybe people can relate about, even if they've not even read about the Argonauts, is that characters in ancient literature are not black and white. You know, everybody's quick to say, oh, Odysseus is a good guy, or Odysseus is a bad guy, or Aeneas is a worse, Aeneas is in a tough position. You know, these characters were not designed to be straight good guys or straight bad guys, and or you know, there's female complicated characters, like Dido's such a complicated character, Penelope's complicated character, Helen, you know.
Very complicated.
Yeah, and there's all these different levels that when you go back and you think about it in that, you know, you read the passages in a different light and you can see these different parts of their character, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
I love seeing, I didn't really realise how kind of, I don't know, ballsy Helen was until when she's standing up against Venus, Aphrodite. I don't know what she is in that book.
Aphrodite and Iliad too.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. But Erica showed me that, and I was sort of thinking, oh damn, she's really standing up for herself, you know. Everyone hates Paris here.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really interesting. So I feel like now is a good time to move on to who your favourite character is.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a difficult question. My favourite character in the Argonaut myth. Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is an interesting one. I mean, I enjoy lots of different characters. I mean, I could pick Atalanta. I do really enjoy Atalanta. And have you read Emily Houser's stuff on that? So Emily's a lecturer in the classics department in Exeter, and she's written 3 novels about. And it sort of takes a golden apple from Greek mythology, and then it sort of explores the story around that. And then she uses, for the Atalanta one, she sends Atalanta on the Argonautica. So she sort of subverts it in all sorts of complicated ways, although it does end up in sort of being romantic at the end of it. So yeah, I mean, Atalanta is the only woman Argonaut. She is in one of the ancient sources, Apollodorus's Bibliotheca, which suggests, so that's a mythographer, right? And so maybe she was already there early in the tradition.
Yeah.
Apollonius deliberately excludes her. So he says, Jason picked up the spear, which Atalanta had given him, hoping that he would let her join the expedition, but he had said no, because she would cause the problems of love, the rivalries of love in the crew. So he's deliberately flagging up the fact that he's excluding her from the expedition. And you know, what would it have been like to be a woman in this cramped quarters, surrounded entirely by highly aggressive, individualistic male heroes? So you know, she's got to be a pretty tough cookie.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do find the character of Atalanta interesting, and the way she's portrayed, say in Robert Graves or Henry Treece, she's highly sexualised. At least in the 20th century, most people include her. Okay, that's good.
That's a start.
But she is incredibly sexualised until we get to the 2000 TV film, where she is just, you know, she's given a sad crush on Jason. and then ends up with this other man who like sort of pursues her, and she sort of gives up resisting, and it's just like one of those romantic subplots that's a bit weak, and you're like, oh, they've just missed an opportunity with this character. She could have been so much cooler. She's much cooler in Atlantis, where she's a sort of quite an independent priestess figure who comes in and rescues the main characters.
Again, third time lucky. Everyone would obviously want to know what your favourite section of the myth is, which I can imagine would be a really hard thing for you to even think about.
I organised the book by different sections, and one of the fascinating things about the Argonaut myth is that different episodes have different cultural histories.
Yeah.
So one of my favourites is the Lemnian women.
Yeah.
Which is a fascinating one because it's all about this society of women that have killed off all the men, and the Argonauts arrive there, and they basically the women are like, oh my god, we're going to be attacked.
Yeah.
And then they're like, but hang on, you know, we need kids because our society will die out otherwise. So they're like, actually, this could be an opportunity. So they basically seduce the Argonauts. And of course, this is a really transgressive and problematic situation, and there's lots of tragedies about it, but we don't have many surviving fragments from them.
Yeah.
So the early we know it's an early story, but we don't know that much about what it involved in the early versions. And it's really interesting how little people have sort of taken that up and developed it in a positive way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of demonisation of the Lemnian women. They're generally presented as sort of monstrous, sexual, seducers that tempt you in. So it really hasn't come on very much since William Morris. So, the 19th century stereotypes are still pretty dominant in the Lemnian women.
Maybe there should be a modern remake of it.
Yeah, well, it's fun. I mean, I am at the moment attempting to write a novel based on the Argonauts.
Very exciting, guys.
I am, and I am sort of stuck on trying to configure the Lemnian women in a way that works for me.
Yeah.
So it's a really fascinating, complex episode. Robert Graves is actually quite interesting on this one, in that basically he presents them as sort of mother goddess worshippers. Pretty much everyone in his version is a mother goddess worshipper. But the nymphs there are sort of positive characters, and Jason and Hypsipyle have a sort of mutually respectful relationship, and it's the sort of overall battle between matriarchy and patriarchy for Graves. So everything is about that, and the Lemnians are just a positive example of matriarchy for him. But I find that whole mother goddess thing quite reductive. Yeah. So I'm not keen on that as a solution.
Well, I'm really excited to see what you do with it.
Right, but yeah. I need to have some creative headspace in order to sort of make progress. I've got about 30,000 words so far. But,
wow, that's a lot.
But there's a lot to go. So
that's really impressive.
I
can't imagine that much work.
Yeah, my central character is Acastus, the son of Peleus.
Oh.
And in this version, I'm basically playing Acastus as trans.
Okay.
So, because I feel like generally there is not enough queering of the Argonaut myth.
Yeah.
So I'm exploring that element, because obviously I've picked Acastus partly because his father is the king, so he's in a pretty privileged position. So but then his father is also the evil tyrant, so he's got to sort of deal with that problem.
Yeah.
And then he's got a difficult relationship with Jason, because Jason is his cousin and might take away his potential kingship. So there's sort of rivalry. Yeah. And in the 1963 film, with the awesome special effects by Ray Harryhausen, he is the baddie. So I wanted to sort of explore his potential for doubleness, that he could go either way, that he could be a goodie or a baddie, he could betray Jason or not. And you could have Jason, you've got both Jason and Medea for him to have crushes on.
I love
that. And generally, that I think puts him sort of between everything, if you see what I mean.
Oh, that's really interesting. We need a Bicon. So I feel like you guys who sort of love the retellings and the sort of mythology, but especially I feel like those of you who sort of really enjoyed Song of Achilles will maybe enjoy this. I don't know, that's what the sort of vibe I'm getting.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. I mean, there are so many brilliant novels being written at the moment about the ancient world and through Greek mythology. And I feel like Greek mythology is a really great way of exploring gender and sexuality, because the ancient world was so different, and there's a sort of openness that creates.
I think that's why people identified so much with Song of Achilles, because it was the first thing that came out that did so well, that explored a gay relationship in the ancient world in a modern way. And I thought that's why it's been so popular with men and women alike.
Yeah. I mean, there obviously there's a really strong tradition of sort of using the ancient world as an inspiration for LGBT people, but so like Mary Renault's novels about Alexander, for instance, are pretty cool as well. And there's a lot of really good stuff, but for some reason it hasn't made it through. It hasn't been done with the Argonauts.
Well, you're filling that gap.
Hopefully.
So if everything goes according to plan, when will your book be out?
Well, I'm still sort of, writing a novel is not the same as writing an academic book.
Yeah.
And I'm still learning. And I'll need to, get people to read it. And I'm sort of anxious about getting the trans element right. So I've been reading a lot about trans experiences and thinking about, trans in the ancient world and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'm also, getting the storytelling right so that it's not too academic. That's quite important as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots to do, and then I need to find a publisher. So it'll be a while.
I mean, well, let us know, because I would love to make sure that anyone who watches my videos, I'm sure they'll be very interested, and I want to let them know when it does come out.
Yay.
Yeah, in a couple of years. I've graduated by then.
You probably.
Definitely. Oh God.
No, I mean, you will definitely have graduated. It will probably take longer than a couple of years.
Oh yeah. Well, if the last one you started in 2013, and that was that was an academic book, it'll take Yeah, it could be
10 years, but I'll try and do it sooner than that. My children have nearly grown up now. I'll have a lot more time for writing.
Well, I've had a really great time, and I can't wait for you guys to read this book. Where is it available for them to buy?
All good bookshops, she says, hopefully. Definitely Bloomsbury website, bookshop.org. So yeah, I hope, go into your local bookshop and ask them to order it.
Yeah, I will leave a link to buy it online down below, and you should definitely check it out. But I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.
Bye.